Howdy of you delicious people. I think we've come to a pass where ultimately looking at this. I always have to ask the question at some point, why am I reviewing this movie? And then I go, F it, let's do it anyways. Because when looking at it, really this movie, it's a very simple film, but eventually we get to a seemingly darker part of these characters' journeys. We eventually have it to where Margaret seems to eventually have seemingly a man that is haunting after her, and we also have it to where Margaret is ultimately going and seemingly finding a younger man to live with, because ultimately it seems that she needs to be with someone of some sort, and ultimately Joe, it just so happens to be that guy. Or ultimately we have it to Margaret is ultimately looking for her son, and ultimately she just finds this guy. So ultimately we have it to where Margaret, it seems the longer and longer we go about this movie, the more it seems like there is mystery afoot about Margaret. It seems like there's a lot of stuff that isn't quite seemingly 100% uh, to be understood through some of this, or you're trying to figure out, wait, is she really doing that? Wait a minute. Are they actually going and like is Joe actually going and seemingly knowing full well what Margaret needs? If you know what I mean. Uh, what is exactly Matt's goal in this movie? Matt is ultimately the guy that is coming into or returning into Margaret's life. What is Matt's goal? What is he trying to do here? What is like he doesn't need to be with Margaret anymore, but he is repetitiously coming after her, haunting her, and I'm like, what is his goal that ultimately uh like I just don't quite understand Matt's character. Why is he going through all this? Does he just enjoy it? Is that to leave Margaret and her son to have been from a bizarrish and or broken home and so on and so forth? Uh, and reasonably, like I would have liked to have like understood any little real stories that kind of really fully fledgedly flush out these characters' real true backstories, because it seems like we are just having people just kind of going through the motions of their life and eventually feeling like they have nowhere else to go, kind of thing. Through a lot of these scenes, we eventually have it to where Margaret is ultimately spending a little bit too long under the water um, through most of this movie. Not only is Margaret a swimmer, but ultimately she is otherwise just spending way too often under the water. I remember the movie called The Graduate, where ultimately we had Dustin Hoffman, who is just underneath the water, just kind of sitting there, ultimately having him to hear absolutely nothing. But we are ultimately to hear the sounds of silence, the Simon and Garfunkel song. Um, to ultimately just remind us that anytime anyone is to go underwater, you hear absolutely nothing but the sounds of crackling waters and the bubbles of which that you are underwater, um, until eventually someone bloosh goes into the water, or anything along those lines. Uh, so going into this movie again, I would have to say that this movie is not for everybody. If really you could have it to where Joe is to be broken down as a gang member, Margaret is eventually to be broken down as a character that eventually, seemingly more and more, eventually is to try and seemingly be far too long into the water, let's just say, to the point of her almost kind of uh, losing air consistently through a lot of the things that she's ending up doing through this. It seems like her thing is to ultimately just get uh, the life choked out of her, let's just say. So, yeah, this movie, again, is not for everybody, and at the end of the day, uh, it is what it is. So, I'm not going to apologize for this one. I'm not. Because reasonably, when looking at it, there's all kinds of movies out there, and this just so happens to be one where I'm like, nah, like people can like all kinds of films, or people could watch all kinds of films, and I'm not going to apologize for that. So, going into this movie, where ultimately can you see this film? Well, for this time around, there wasn't a convenient app to dare, in fact, watch this. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you could probably go out of your way to go into any movie pro or movie play box or ultimately a movie box or uh, TV crushes or something of some kind and eventually watch this movie at some point, or ultimately you can decide to find a way to watch it in some convenience. Eventually, you could probably go through any movie app to eventually see if this movie is in that said app. So let's ultimately go into that double five to otherwise branch into the normal double five time count. I'm going to have to skirt around a few things here and there. Um, but also, I'm not quite 100% sure about certain scenes because ultimately it could look like it's something, but then again, some people could ultimately say, oh, like maybe she is just washing this kid in the tub, and that's all that's going on there. Weirdly enough, so let's go into this movie because ultimately this one is a movie where I'm like, nah, I'm not gonna apologize for this one. I'm not, because recently I like how simple this movie is, and then ultimately there is also a point in time where when you get down to it, it's also a lot of dark story, which ultimately, if you've seen any number of movies that I have ultimately reviewed, like The Vicious Kind, where ultimately that is a very dark beginning to that movie, where ultimately not everyone will like that, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of movies that have an edge to them. There's a lot of movies that are very dark and gritty, and I've reviewed a lot of those. Like the movie Crash, I've reviewed that one, and ultimately that's a very dark and gritty film where people are desperate to get into car accidents so they can get some adrenaline high, and so on and so forth. Like I've reviewed all kinds of movies that are dark and gritty. And ultimately, I know a ton of other movies that are also dark and gritty, also into the noggin of my brain. So, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I get to spoil this movie. So, Margaret ultimately is a swimmer. There's a ton of scenes that ultimately Margaret or Joe are both in a pool together. Because ultimately, at some point, Margaret is going to teach Joe how to swim. So, in the very beginning of this, we have Margaret who is in a pool that is just swimming out of her way to ultimately find a kid that is ultimately going to plop his way into this pool, and ultimately Margaret is to eventually kind of adjust via people being in this pool. So we evidently have Margaret that is consistently swimming at this pool, and eventually she ends up going and doing. It seems like she's really part of this neighborhood. Eventually, she is to ultimately do things here and there. We ultimately find that I think she's a tailor of sorts, which I would naturally assume because it seems like she is doing selling clothes and or a thrift store. So we eventually have it to where Matt is to come into Margaret's life to ultimately come and have her go to this diner to tell her that ultimately their son had gone missing. And that ultimately, like, I'm to assess any number of things that there's a reason where Margaret had left Matt, and evidently Matt had been forced to, or Matt had probably forced his son to be with him, and so recently we had it to where like there's a way darker story that ultimately I could kind of configure and assess and or understand, and I don't want to go that far dark, but there's a really dark story that I'm assessing could have happened between Matt, Margaret, and probably their son to lead to where their son eventually heads to where he is all of a sudden missing, and then eventually where he ends up. So we have it to ultimately Matt is telling her that her son is missing, gives her a missing poster. Like, it's not like the old times when we'd have kids on a milk carton. So we have it to where Margaret is like, well, what should I do with this poster? And so she ends up just taping it onto her door of her business. And so eventually, we find that Margaret is again swimming and ultimately posting that she wants to have a lodging and or co-person to live with. It seems that ultimately she's willing to kind of just have anybody at this place that ultimately she lives in, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Margaret is to go and eventually try and look for her son, and eventually she finds this character named Joe, who seemingly is probably drunk off of his butt, probably blacked out drunk or something like that, and eventually we find out that this kid had hurt his hand. It seems that there had been glass that had ultimately gone into his hand, or his wrist, to ultimately allude to any number of things. So we end up having Margaret going and dragging this guy into her establishment, and ending up trying to give him first aid and otherwise try and bandage this guy's wounds. Ultimately, Margaret goes to get some water, and this guy ultimately leaves this area. So eventually we find it to where Margaret is seeing this guy Joe come into this pool, and Margaret is to ultimately go after this guy named Joe and ultimately ask how his wound is healing, and ultimately he shows her, and she's like, oh, well, like, that's great, and ultimately she wants to know a little bit about this Joe, and ultimately mention, like, hey, like, I have a lodging thing for free. I have a room for free that ultimately, like, you can stay in until someone else comes along. And so ultimately, Joe ends up uh, going along with living with this girl, Margaret. It seems that ultimately he is to go and like fix her car and uh, like help her out with like kind of common like things and so on and so forth. Eventually, we have it to where Joe is to smoke weed and drink with Margaret, and eventually she like tells him that he's not a very good swimmer, and ultimately we have it to where Margaret eventually uh, tries to train Joe on how to swim, and ultimately Joe just wants to have fun. Because we ultimately find out that Joe is a person that ultimately lures in some guy uh, to have his other gang members beat up on this one guy and steal his wallet. That's like the thing. Ultimately, have some young, good-looking guy that is going to lure a uh, like a stalker-ish like guy that is going to follow him around to ultimately get this gang to ultimately beat that guy up and steal his wallet. So we ultimately find out that Joe is very mature within this pool, ultimately lifting Margaret up and then doing a bunch of splashing. They're having fun, but eventually the lifeguard is like, hey, no splashing. And ultimately, we have it to where Joe is giving this guy the finger, and Margaret doesn't want anything to do with Joe's immaturity because that kind of shows the difference of ages between the two of them. So we end up having it to where at some point we have it to where Margaret is to eventually give, or here's the thing: Margaret ends up going and finding out that her son had died. They had found his body somewhere, and Matt is calling her to let her know that she can't go to the funeral, and so on and so forth. I'm like, what is going on with this family? But ultimately, I can't make the real true consensus of what's going on. And ultimately, there could be ultimately so many different opinions and whatever. Um, and ultimately, I also think that there's something wrong with Matt. Uh, Hence why he's repetitiously going after Margaret, but it doesn't seem like he's going after her trying to rekindle this relationship. If anything, it just seems that Matt is trying to uh, just ruin Margaret's life of sorts, asking about her at work and all kinds of things, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually Margaret is to get clothes from Matt that was her son's. And so ultimately, since Joe is about the same size as her kid, we end up having it to where Margaret gives Joe Margaret's son's clothes. So ultimately, it's just like, well, hey, you need more clothes, so here you go, because it doesn't really seem like you have any clothes on you. So we end up having it to where Margaret ends up. We end up having Joe putting on some clothes and ultimately asking if Margaret likes any of them. And so Margaret ends up going and putting it on to the way that she likes for him to wear it, and ultimately starts sniffing him, and then ultimately goes off to apologize, and then leaves. So we have it to where Joe is to like it gets to the point to where Joe is ultimately meeting Matt consistently because Margaret is to eventually uh, or Margaret is to eventually take care of Joe at some point. We end up having it to where Joe goes out and ends up getting humiliated by his gang members because eventually we have it to where Joe eventually takes a drive with Margaret, and we get that kind of consistently through this movie. And eventually their gang members meet Margaret or see Margaret, and ultimately they are to give Joe crap about Margaret, like, hey, you have a wife at home? And Joe's like, shut up. And so ultimately the gang member is like, well, hey, like it's not going to be so nice when ultimately you're going to be outnumbered, kind of thing, like really threatening him to ultimately just remember your place, kind of thing. So we eventually have it to where Joe is to ultimately kind of have a bad night with his gang. So ultimately he goes home and gets really emotional and starts to cry because ultimately uh, the only person that he has left in his life is really just his gang and basically Margaret. And ultimately it's not like he can ever go home again because ultimately he has a sock that ultimately has a picture of him and his mom. So you ultimately have it to where Joe is to ultimately start crying in the tub and ultimately just trying to wash himself. I guess from the gang fight from that night. And so we ultimately have it to where Margaret ends up coming in and washing a little bit more than just this guy's back, let's just say. And ultimately we have it to where Margaret and Margaret is ultimately trying to wash a little bit below the belt, if you know what I mean. And it seems like we are to questionably cement whether Joe and Margaret are going to be a little bit more than just roomies, if you know what I mean. So, moving on. So, we go into Margaret consistently, like going swimming, and it seems that more and more she is staying longer and longer and longer underneath the waters, and we end up having it to where Joe is eventually seemingly knowing full well what it seems that Margaret needs. It seems like they go on a road trip again to eventually have her go into some sea where ultimately Joe goes skinny dipping and Margaret ends up just going out there with lingerie into the ocean or into this lake or whatever it is. And so eventually we have it for Joe is to tell uh, Margaret about the awful things that him and his gang used to do and this and that. And so we have Margaret who is putting herself under the water, ultimately, as per usual, to just kind of wait for as long as she can to be under the water. And we ultimately have it to where Margaret is eventually starting to lose air, and Joe has to rescue her. And because ultimately, I'm assessing that Margaret is to uh, like black out or pass out for being under the water for too long. And so we end up having Joe rescue her ultimately to not like scorn her or whatever. It's like, hey, whatever your thing is whatever your thing is. We eventually have to at some point where Joe is showcasing like how they were to put their hands on one another to try to eventually find themselves to be able to black out him and his gang members, because ultimately it's like they have done all kinds of crazy stuff. So eventually we have it to where Matt is consistently trying to get into Margaret's life by when Margaret is to just go out with friends or go to somewhere where there's people present. Eventually, Matt is to go and meet her at this bar and to talk to her. Eventually, Joe is to intercept these conversations, and Matt is getting a little bit kind of frustrated with this young kid ultimately just talking to Margaret. And eventually we find out that Matt notices that Joe seemingly has the clothes that their son has had. Uh, Ultimately, eventually, Matt is to confront Margaret about, hey, this kid is wearing the clothes that our son used to wear. And Margaret's like, well, he needed clothes. And Matt is like, yeah, sure. All right. So we eventually at some point have it to where ultimately uh, Joe's gang leader ultimately uh, breaks into Margaret's home, and ultimately Margaret goes into what I would assess is peeing herself while this leader is standing in front of her, and she just pees herself, and ultimately we have it to where the leader's like, you were sick, and then ultimately he runs back off to not steal anything or whatever. I think it's just to scare her, and ultimately he ends up just leaving instead. We end up having it to where Matt is to ultimately try and confront Joe by going along with him at a bar, and ultimately having Matt try to talk supposedly some sense into Joe, but Joe doesn't see anything wrong with him spending so much time with Margaret. And when looking at it, like, I think Joe is kind of whiffing the fact that Matt is wrong for Margaret, and ultimately we have it to where Joe at some point headbutts Matt, and then eventually we have it to where Matt is going to try to get even by beating the living crap out of Joe with a piece of log and everything like that, just or piece of like wood, just beating the crap out of him to the point where ultimately Joe has to go to the hospital. But before that happens, we eventually have it to where um, Margaret is basically watching Joe at some point. Like it seems like there is an escalation of eventually Joe seemingly meeting a girl and eventually bringing her home to ultimately um, have the door cracked open for Margaret to eventually hear Joe and his woman going at it. To ultimately Margaret is to eventually hear what is to go on and eventually walk back out of the room, and they ultimately say nothing to one another about all that. We eventually have it to where Margaret is ultimately feeling like eventually she is shifting seemingly into being so much more of a darker character. At some point, it seems that there had been a baby that had been left unattended. Margaret goes to try to protect the baby, and eventually we have the woman who drives back to come and collect her kid, and the kid is scarred. So ultimately, that makes Margaret ultimately just feel um, saddened by this scarring of this baby. And so Margaret eventually goes into a tub to go and seemingly try to do what Joe had said before about putting his hands on the person's own neck. But it seems that ultimately this won't do the job of having Margaret black out. So we eventually have it to where Margaret is trying this bizarrish technique of sorts. And we have it to where Joe ultimately just walks in because ultimately the door is cracked open, anyways. And Joe walks in and ultimately um, is to help Margaret be able to black out by putting her arm around her head, let's just say. And Joe ends up seeing her black out, and ultimately Joe is to take his arm from around her, and ultimately she wakes back up right away. And then we have toward Joe is ultimately realizing that he had given Margaret what she had wanted, and it seems that Joe ultimately is just really at this point he is too like, well, like I think we know what they both wanted at that same simultaneous point. It seems that Joe is consistently seeing Margaret or just sprawled out all over upon this tub, and so ultimately Joe ends up going and performing a tub act of sorts that ultimately I cannot mention because when looking at it, this one is a little bit harder to carve out and say bedroom business because it doesn't take place in a bedroom. It takes place in a bathroom. So bathroom business, I guess, is what we're gonna have to go with this one. So ultimately, Joe and Margaret are to go at it, and really that is just cementing that um, there is an escalation like seemingly going between these two characters, and that is to lead to this moment. So eventually we have it to where again uh, Joe is to ultimately get beaten up by Matt, and Margaret ends up seemingly being at home, and Joe eventually comes back all scarred and battered and beaten, and we have it to where Margaret is like checking all of Joe's wounds and eventually sending him to the hospital, where it seems that ultimately Joe is to want to go alone into speaking to this doctor, and we have it coincidentally where uh, Joe's mother ends up arriving at this hospital, hearing that he is there, and so I guess things are just going to eventually just work out for Joe. And ultimately, Margaret ends up just leaving, and ultimately, that is kind of just the tail end of this movie in all actuality. So I'd kind of just rushed through a lot of this and skirted around a lot of things, but when looking at it, uh, yeah, I thought that this movie was simple and dark. That's all I could really say. And plus, also there was things that I couldn't actually talk about within this movie. But there's also like there's a lot of interesting moments. But then again, there's also a lot of moments where ultimately people would say like God, like I watched this movie and I didn't like this part and I didn't like that part and so on and so forth. And that is what it is. Uh, Again, me not really apologizing for this movie. Um, because yeah, there's all kinds of films. And when looking at it, this is one of those. So yeah, very simple film, but at the end of the day, that's all I want to see with this movie. But I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.